All right, thanks everyone for coming. We're the Office of Applied Strategy. Thank you for having us at FEST and coming over. My name is Tony Wang, and this is my colleague, Helen Chen. For those of you who don't know us, we are a strategy firm based out of New York City. We sort of operate under three arms. We have a consulting arm, we have a think tank, which is why we're here today, and we also run an angel fund. This is our team portrait. I see OAS sort of as both a commercial entity, but also a playground to have fun and do cool shit. For example, you might have seen that we're coordinated in a pretty intense uniform. This actually is a custom uniform that was designed by Peter Do, the fashion designer. It's coming out next month as part of his newest diffusion line that he's launching. And we do a lot of fun shit. And for me, I think OAS is a vehicle to work with really interesting people in really disparate fields and to really apply this sort of anti-disciplinary approach to collaboration. Most people at OAS have their own practices, have their own studios, have their own full-time roles. So it's really like a semi-permeable membrane in terms of how we work with our collaborators. We're also working with Raihan, so if you guys know him, find him, and he'll let you sniff this project we're working on. So we're making productivity poppers. And they wake you up. So I'm gonna just sniff that fur. Good luck. Our think tank publishes research every year. Last year we published a book called OAS Dossier. It's an annual format that we started, and the first text that we published was called Hyper-Optimization. It was pretty polarizing. When it came out, one editor from The New Yorker lambasted us on Twitter and was like, it's the most nonsensical, navel-gazing thing we've ever seen, which I loved. And then another editor from The New Yorker was like, wait, I love this. So we ended up being featured in the February 10th issue of The New Yorker with a profile on our research process. One of our kind of key points of differentiation, or sort of an ethos for how we do thought leadership, we don't publish our research online. It's always a physical object. I was pretty inspired by Chris Dixon from Andreessen, his essay, 1,000 True Fans. So we only published 1,000 copies of this and gave it out to friends. So it became a bit of this like kind of meme-y thing. It sold on Grailed for $200. And so for this year's edition, we created it in the form of an employee badge, which we're giving out for free. There's an NFC chip. We did it with IYK, and you can tap your phone and get access to the dossier. But more on that at the end. I want to talk to you about the big idea that we've been working on and thinking about as a team for our second dossier, which we've titled The New Pantheon. And one of the most exciting parts of doing this process of research and then coming to FEST and hearing our friends like Ruby or Edmund or even Emily talk about sort of what they have to share, I see a lot of convergence in the thinking, and that's really exciting. So we kind of started with this idea of progress. We talk about it in our first dossier, but we kind of talk about how cultural production and distribution have become so oriented towards optimization at the cost of progress. And so we wanted to return to the question of optimization versus progress and then talk a bit about, well, what is progress, right? It's one of the most enduring yet contested ideas in human history. Is it a guaranteed trajectory? Is it something that will always improve over time? Is it a political question? Is it a social question? Is it economic, technological? Progress, as we understand it today, is inherently rooted in an Enlightenment tradition. Hegel, Kant, a lot of philosophers really tackled that during the Enlightenment. And one of the big sort of things was they created this sort of myth that progress was one consistent rhythm that sort of linked everything from politics to economics to morality to science to culture into one lockstep achievement. And it was rooted in this idea of like rationality. But progress is a darker side. It's justified imperial conquest. It has necessitated the exploitation of workers. And the reality of it is that while many of us can look at objective measures of progress, and the writer Steven Pinker, who authored the book Enlightenment Now, and a lot of neoliberals would argue, well, the world is better than ever. Just look at all the metrics. But those metrics lie, right? Especially in a post-truth context, I think the lived realities of individual sentiment tell a vastly different story. And so I'm reminded of Anna Singh, who wrote this phenomenal book, The Mushroom at the End of the World, and she has this really great quote about this sort of false narrative, this false myth that if we just link ourselves to the rhythm of progress, to capitalism, to growth, that we too will move in lockstep. Emily came here earlier today in her talk, The End of Trends, and she talked a bit about, I think, this idea of asynchronous rhythms in contemporary society, which I really agree with. And she talks about it in the context of, back in the day, trend forecasters would be like, well, if this person is an early adopter, they're going to be early for everything. But the reality is you can be early for one thing and completely late for something else. And I think this asynchronicity of sort of contemporary culture is something that we should really kind of think about, because the great myth of progress forces us to move in lockstep with capitalism and with the rhythm of society. But, that doesn't work. And I think that creates a deep sense of grievance, of doom, of alienation, right? And across a lot of global barometers, Edelman does one every year, the Global Trust Barometer, consistently over the past decade, our global levels of trust have been declining, and it doesn't show any sense of improving. In the most recent Trust Barometer, it found that 61% of people globally feel a sense of grievance towards governments and businesses. They feel that these systems are actually not designed to help them, but to benefit the oligarchy, to benefit individuals, to serve narrow interests. And so when only 36% of people globally believe that the world will be left in a better state for the next generation, the future is stagnant. And so that creates a deep sense of alienation. And when the present is alienating, when the status quo alienates us, it creates some incredible shifts in global attitude and behaviors. I think this is reflected very much so in the rise of these sort of dark horse challenger archetypes, from Donald Trump to Greta Thunberg to Luigi Mangione. The more polarizing the public figure, the more relevant they become in our society. And you also see this across sort of behaviors, especially with younger Gen Z sort of audiences. TikTok product hack culture is really popular, and I think that is sort of a kind of like symptom of our desire to find ways to like dismantle and hack the system. I thought one really interesting stat was that 42% of Gen Z have willingly admitted to engaging or being willing to engage in credit card fraud. And they don't see it as like a bad thing. They see it as just a little bit of chipping away at the system and getting sort of what is rightfully theirs in a system that is unfair. But you also see it in the rise of anti-democratic sentiment globally. The Open Society Barometer did a global survey and found that the younger you are, the more likely you are to actually believe in an authoritarian government as a more effective form of governance than democracy. 35% of Gen Z believe that, and in America, it's a bit lower, but it's 29% of Gen Z believe that an authoritarian leader would be more effective. And that's pretty startling. So, the Dark Enlightenment and its associated concepts of accelerationalism, network states, techno-feudalism, they're not fringe anymore, and they've been embraced by some of the most powerful people of our times. And so, historically, and Slavoj Žižek published a book earlier this year called Against Progress, and he claims and notes that, the ways in which people would respond to this alienation is either to deny it, to pretend that, climate change doesn't exist, or to seek reform, to actively advocate, to be an activist. And he claims that the newest and most popular sort of form of responding to alienation is disavowal, which is something I've been thinking a lot about, right? And disavowal for him is this idea that like you fully accept doom, you fully accept that the world will be in a worse place in the future, but you just continue on as ever. His quote is, "We see it lived out amongst vast swaths of people who fully accept climate change and impeding environmental collapse. And yet, nevertheless, they continue to reproduce, they continue to drive cars, to eat meat, to rely on technologies, as if the resources were limitless." And so that leads us to this idea of polarization, which is sort of where we really started doing our research and thinking about, well, I think it's not that crazy to say we live in a polarized time, but what we really wanted to think about was, okay, what is the nature of polarization, and how might we be able to craft a broader narrative and sense-making of this polarization, right? Is polarization going to raise our sense of the future? Is there a way to channel it in a productive capacity? And I would actually argue that especially in American politics today, both sides of the spectrum are inherently reactionary. I think that's pretty easy to see with conservative movements. They're inherently reactionary. But what kind of a future does a exclusionary conservative platform offer for the vast majority of us? But progressive agendas, fashionably as of late, are also very anti, right? They're also reactionary. They're anti-fascist, they're anti-carceral, anti-racist, anti-colonial. They don't necessarily offer a true cohesive vision of a better future. The progressive side has become just as reactionary as the conservative side. And so it's not to equate the two sides to each other whatsoever. It's simply to say that the fashion of political polarization today is one that is rooted in sort of stagnation. Regardless of which way you go, you sort of still feel like the future has no real sense of momentum. But then we asked ourselves, well, could the raising that is caused by polarization also plant the seeds of our renewal? And so we look a lot to nature for this, and ecology is something that Helen and I are both really inspired by and try to infuse into our strategic thinking. And so in nature, there's a category of plants called pyrophytic plants that actually thrive in flames, right? Some of them actually require flames to thrive within nature. And this is ancient knowledge that actually the first people have known and employed for ages. And in a lot of ways, the irony of modernism is us rediscovering ancient knowledge from people that we have colonized, whose knowledge we have seen as other or as unvaluable, but we've rediscovered, and then the Erewhon girlies of LA are the prophets of their efficacy. And so polarization, there's actually this interesting aspect where it's the action and the opposite reaction, right? It is the counterforce and the force. It is the yin and the yang. And so polarization, we believe, actually allows us to meet back in the middle. And we'll talk more about what we mean by this, but we're arguing that polarization can create the conditions for convergence by bringing us back to a new middle, a better middle. And so could we perhaps actually imagine a future where polarization actually allows us to kind of imagine new narratives of progress? And so, we coined this term horseshoe maximalism, which is sort of one of the key terms that we have in our second dossier. And so what we mean by that is, instead of thinking about sort of political, social, economic spectrums as a flat line, it might be better to think of it as like a U shape, right? This term was coined in the 1970s by a French writer, the horseshoe theory, and it basically states that, people on the far left and the far right have more in common with each other than people who are centrists, right, who are moderates. And we would actually argue that taken to the extreme, the logical conclusion is that the horseshoe would have you guys, have us meet back in the middle. It would kind of turn into a pretzel. So we talk about the pretzelification of culture. And we see this increasingly actually in culture. We'll show you some actual examples of trends and phenomena that really embody this. And so, I think a lot about this quote from Charlie Inman, who's an art director, also photographer, but he wrote this phenomenal book, and he, talks about the horseshoe and says, maybe it's just this makeshift pincer to make us feel like we have just a little bit of control over the chaos of our lives. And, it's why, Goop and InfoWars both lean into alternative wellness. They actually sell pretty much the exact same supplements, but they're branded very differently. This is and there are a lot of products that will the exact same active ingredient, but one is kind of like Sun Potion, the other is like the Rio Red Pill, or like Wake Up America, exclamation mark. So you see the alchemical process of transformation, of polarization into convergence. And so what exists within this gap is what we're calling cultural dark matter. We've heard some people in other talks say the void, the chasm, and it's very much that. And we think this is actually super fertile territory to look at new cultural trends that embrace the logic of polarization. And so cultural dark matter is interesting because it bypasses traditional social and political categories. So it's almost like a form of disintermediation. If you play video games in the 80s and 90s, like Super Mario Brothers, they had this wraparound mechanic. It was developed mostly as a way to get around hardware limitations, but if you go off one side of the screen, you just appear on the other side, right? And I think a lot of the nature of political polarization today is very much that. Traditionally, if someone went from far right to far left, they would go all the way back around. But today, you see ideological swapping happening, within this chasm, right? I think the manosphere is like perfect territory to watch this kind of unfold in real time, whether it's like Joe Rogan or it's Andrew Schultz. Andrew Schultz most recently having that podcast, kind of saying like, I might not agree with Mondami, but I actually think he's New York first, and that's the most important thing. So it's interesting to see like social democrats and MAGA bros sort of converging in agreement. And I think you can see a lot of examples of this. And so I think this area, which is not well studied, is what we should be thinking a lot more about. And so as the gaps begin to kind of close, it gives rise to this category of trends that we're calling horseshoe maximalist. And the idea here is like the more dissonant the two ideas are, the more they just seem to converge upon each other in a form of like quantum superposition. They actually don't contradict each other because stacking contradiction works because you're layering incompatible beliefs to solve for different problems. So it's a really interesting phenomena that we can see across a lot of different sort of categories, from wellness to gambling to consumer goods. And Edmund, who gave his talk Hard Reboot, talks about metamodernism, and I see a lot of similarities here in this sort of line of thinking. So consider how so many cultural trends seem to bring together disparate, contradictory assemblages of ideas, values, and audiences into sort of this unexpected coalition. So from alternative wellness to speculation to alternative economies to digital assets to even like technomysticism, we see a lot of sort of trends that actually break down traditional social categorizations. And what's really interesting is that it provokes encounters. And we're going to talk more about the word encounter, but it brings people who normally wouldn't interact with each other, especially in our algorithmically induced like echo chambers, to actually meet each other over a shared interest. And so it lets us actually break past the algorithm in a certain way. We're also surrounded by extremities in culture, and it turns some of the most serious institutions into the most unserious things. I mean, the one on the left you guys probably have seen before, but I don't know if you know, but the Vatican has an anime mascot. It's an official mascot. It's pretty interesting to see. They also did a collab with Dolce & Gabbana last month where they had 40 bishops walk the runway show. So it's a pretty interesting, time we live in. I think horseshoe maximalism has warped so many of these institutions that they've turned into like sports betting platforms or reality television shows. And it's a way for us to try to gain some semblance of narrative control over a world in which we have lost control. And so, from this idea of horseshoe maximalism, we asked ourselves, well, how can we channel that in a productive way? And so we were reminded a lot of Donna Haraway, who wrote this text, Staying with the Trouble. And we really thought that that was a really powerful sort of proclamation, right? Cultural dark matter creates these unexpected coalitions, and I think it creates these encounters, like people who you wouldn't normally meet otherwise, but because you have an interest in like labubus or raw milk or like doomsday prepping, you meet these people who have very different beliefs from you, and it kind of breaks past the echo chamber. And in nature, the word encounter is really important because in human society, we tend to think of connections in a very binary sense, but in nature, you've got competition, mutualism, parasites, prey, predator, symbiosis. There's so many more types of relationships in nature, and that's what makes encounters indeterminate, right? You don't know what's going to happen afterwards, and there's an ambivalence to it. When social media talks of connection, it's an algorithmically predictable quantity. So I would actually argue it's more like a disconnection than a connection. And what we need to do is, actually have meaningful collaboration and sort of like collisions with other people in the world. And I think that's where cultural dark matter presents a very interesting opportunity. And so, for us, I think the other sort of aspect of nature that really we wanted to pull references from is fungi, right? Fungi has one really interesting trick that no other kingdom of life has. They metabolize externally. So every other kingdom of life, like animals, we metabolize internally. Fungi have to release their enzymes outside their body. It breaks down the organic structures around them, but it also creates nutritional value that it basically has to share with other life around it. It's why a lot of fungi are symbiotic, right? And it's why they create these really complex networks with plants and trees and roots, and they build these mycelial networks, right? And so I think the fact that it actually breaks down structures around it while also nourishing life within it and nearby it That's fascinating. And I'm like, that's kind of what cultural dark matter does, right? It allows us to chip away at establishment structures, which are the source of our alienation. It creates this polarization, which can bring us back together. And so, whether it's network states or, doomsday prepping, the enzymatic qualities of reorganizing culture from the margins is what I think really excites us about this idea of like horseshoe maximalism. How can we bring different assemblages of people together who normally wouldn't encounter each other, especially within the echo chambers of digital media today? And so, if fungi represents this kind of vitality that can kind of give life to culture, we also wonder whether polarization can help us create new narratives of progress that emerge from assemblages, from indeterminacies, from contradictions, and from encounters. And so that brings us back to our title, The New Pantheon, right? And in this sense, the Pantheon, they're not people. It's not like, Zuckerberg or Musk or Trump. They're stories. And so, for us, progress as a mythology is a really interesting framing because as an Enlightenment concept, it's so rooted in rationality and myths are not seen as rational. But it's not to diminish the power of the idea of progress by calling it a myth. I actually think it gives it power because myths have liminality, and that liminality is actually something that allows myths to navigate polarized landscapes. So much like cultural dark matter, myths are liminal. They can be understood as truth. They elucidate the nature of the world. They can be the origin stories of where we come from, but they're also fictional. And the thing about myths is that they're true and false at the same time. They are allegorical parables that encode fundamental social mores. They're rooted in the past. They explain the world's origins, but they're also a roadmap for the future. They give a sense of collective destiny. And even though they emerge through the large-scale process of collective authorship, there's no singular creator for bodies of mythologies. They're also deeply personal and individual. You can interpret a myth however you want, and you can almost like fork your own interpretation of a myth and eventually create a whole different interpretation. I mean, just look at the formation of modern religion today and different sects and branches of religion. And so their narrative effectiveness is not limited to a specific aperture of scale. And I think scale is something that has been super interesting for us because to be able to resist sort of scale is something that's really important for new narratives of progress to sort of emerge. And so this quality of liminality allows it to be both centralized and fragmented at the same time. If you were here for Nick's talk earlier, his immersive experience kind of really shows that narrative of myth-making kind of happening in real time. And so new narratives of authenticity, of community, of entertainment, of worth that emerge from the phenomena of cultural dark matter, these are the myths of progress that will bring us forward towards the idea of real possibility, right? So our sort of conclusion is like, be a horseshoe maxi, right? Embrace contradiction, embrace polarization. Instead of disavowing the present, you don't have to embrace or reject it. You can find ways to coexist between the spectrum of apocalyptic despair and techno-optimism. But this means that we have to learn how to live in a world that is irreversibly polarized, but not yet finished. And so we conclude with this sort of saying, memento mythos, the myth is false, but the myth-making, the act of achieving your ideals of progress, whatever myth that is always true. And so in our full dossier, we have 6 chapters that go into different narratives and myths, and we go into different kind of deep dives. But in the remaining time we have left, I want to pass it off to Helen, who is going to share her chapter, which is on a very specific topic that I think is going to be relevant for people at FEST. And it's around new mythologies of freedom, of community, of third spaces. So yeah, I'll pass it off.
All right.
Go. Good luck.
Thank you, Tony. So to understand the need for rethinking third spaces in the context of freedom, I want to begin by talking about the current landscape of traditional third spaces and the challenges that we're experiencing. So in the past few decades, we have witnessed a dramatic erosion of institutionally supported top-down third spaces. And at the same time, we are experiencing a loneliness epidemic across the world, but especially in the US, where 57% of Americans reported feeling lonely as traditional gathering spaces from parks and libraries to community centers have dwindled, heavily due to government defunding and COVID-19 closures. We've experienced a huge decrease in, on average, I think folks have been interacting and socializing 20 hours less per week, which is quite significant if you think about the amount of time we spend just engaging in work and the logistics of our daily lives. But third spaces are incredibly vital for our well-being. Third spaces offer relational environments, offer spaces for gathering outside of work and home where new identities, solidarities, and subcultures can emerge. But instead, we increasingly inhabit what Marc Augé calls non-spaces, which are generic, homogeneous, and transitional environments detached from any locality, culture, or relational meaning. And what instead happens are standardized, surveilled interactions, stripping us of identity, rootedness, and social agency. So think of like sterile office lobbies, ubiquitous commercial chains where it's very in and out. Think of train stations, service roads, supermarkets, and like waiting rooms. But freedom emerges through informal parallel infrastructures and bottom-up third spaces that serve the community and not bait them to control them. So how might emergent marginalized third spaces born of collective survival, care, and refusal become fertile ground for new mythologies of freedom? So today I want to explore how marginalized communities are creating pericultural third spaces. So I'm drawing from Anna Tsing's concept of pericapitalism, which refers to the entanglements in communities where capitalist and non-capitalist forms interact. But rather than focusing only on economic relationships, pericultural spaces exist within and beside dominant cultural norms, creating alternative worlds of meaning, practice, and belonging. So I'll be examining 3 communities that challenge fundamental assumptions about how third spaces should be: sex workers, skaters, seed stewards. I want to emphasize that when I refer to sex workers, I mean sex workers by choice, not by coercion. Sex workers by choice who form new mythologies of permanence through ephemeral collaboration networks, skateboarders who form new mythologies of permission through unauthorized space transformation, and seed stewards who form new mythologies of preservation through knowledge sharing and adaptation practices. I also want to caveat that these communities are complex and heterogeneous, with inequities to access of resources across different demographics and geographies. But my focus on their world-building tactics aims to acknowledge both the inspiration they provide through resistance and creativity and the real constraints of their marginalization. But what unites these communities is how they refuse disavowal through world building and precarity. They don't pretend that their challenges don't exist, and instead they generate thriving alternatives within and through these constraints. So unlike traditional third spaces that require institutional support, pericultural spaces thrive in the margins, in the gaps, ruins, and overlooked corners where communities experiment with new ways of being together. So I'll begin with sex workers by choice and how they build ephemeral collaboration networks that challenge our assumptions about permanence in third spaces. So all over the world, sex workers are forming ad hoc collab houses, whether it's Airbnbs, short-term rentals that are turned into mobile hubs for gathering and collaborating. Many of these collab houses are ephemeral and distributed, almost like these moments where folks decide on a location, gather, work together, and then disperse. Although the example that I have on the right side is example of a more permanent collab house that was started by OnlyFans creator Bryce Adams, which reflects how I think the space of adult content creation is becoming more rapidly growing in scale. But I wanted to show this as an example of how these sex workers gather and spend time together. Because what's remarkable is how these spaces function. So originally, folks meet to build collective economies for production and distribution of content. But what happens is that these collab houses evolve into sites of mutual support, trust, and creative autonomy. Sex worker communities form stronger bonds within and beyond work. They become travel partners. They become creative allies. They create vetted networks of collaborators. And they talk about their goals, desires outside of sex work. So moving on to my second case study, which explores how skateboarders act as vigilante urban planners, showing us that public spaces can emerge without official support and approval. So skateboarders don't see the city as something that's just used for work, profit, and efficiency. Instead, they experiment with it. They see potential in staircases and empty lots and curbs as spaces for play, for gathering, and for expression. So it's exploring about what a space can be and not what it is. So it's engaging in this choreography of layering experiences onto existing spaces. The example I have here is in San Francisco, skateboarders took over the UN Plaza, which was a space that was in destitute conditions for decades. The city was really trying to figure out a way to revitalize it. But what happened was, for the last few years, skaters kind of just took over. And eventually, with some support from the city, revitalized it by adding additional ramps, fixing the roads. So it became actually one of the city's most successful and low-cost urban renewals. It was like $200,000 versus the millions and millions they pour in. And in my final case study, I want to talk about seed stewards, which enable adaptive ecologies, ensuring the survival of our food systems, cultures, and ancestral knowledge through living, evolving preservation practices. So we're living in a time where our ecosystems, and thus our food systems, are facing a lot of precarity. And with biodiversity loss and displacement due to climate and geopolitical crises, seed stewards are forming networks that share resources. So through WhatsApp groups, sharing knowledge, gardening diaries, having traveling seed libraries, sending each other seeds, and having pop-up community gardens and kitchens. So seed steward networks function not as static preservation systems, but as living archives with fluid, adaptive modes of ancestral knowledge transmission. And in resisting monoculture and displacement, they uphold food sovereignty, the right to define, grow, and share nourishment on their own terms. They share, distribute more than just seeds, but the preservation of cultures and practices that are in danger. And so these insights are not to provide answers, but to catalyze questions, provocations that sit with the complexity we've explored, opening up spaces for reimagining. So some questions I leave you with are, what spaces are we not using because we're waiting for permission we'll never get, instead of claiming it through presence? What if we created parallel third spaces within existing infrastructure rather than trying to replace it entirely? What if third spaces were built to be easily moved, shared, dissolved, and designed for adaptation rather than permanence? So I'd like to wrap this up with some words from Bayo Komolafe, who reminds us that we need trickster approaches. We need ways of dancing away or dancing to fugitive spaces, dancing to sanctuaries where we can shapeshift. So how can we think about cracks, spillages, and patches, not just as spaces of fugitivity, but spaces where we can garner collective survival and collective flourishing? Thank you. I'll pass it back to Tony.
Yeah. So really quickly, 1 minute, you might have gotten these badges. If not, they're available somewhere. Pick one up. They're also in the merch store. As mentioned, we never release our research online. So this year, we created these badges with IYK. Pick one up. It's an NFC chip. Tap it on your phone, and it gives you one-time access to the dossier online. You can read it as many times as you want, share it with friends, but you can't share it on social media. The link breaks. So it functions just like a book. So it's a fun little design object, and that's how you'll read Dossier 2. The intro is only online right now, but the full paper will come out October of this year. So keep tapping, and you'll find the full version, which will have 6 chapters and multiple contributors and experts that we interview. So I look forward to hopefully having you guys read it. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any feedback, comments, disagreements. We love dialogue and discourse. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Congrats. I'll give you a hug. Congrats. Yeah, you did it.
Okay.